The opening of the library takes place on April 23rd, 1932, Shakespeare's birthday. The ambassadors from Great Britain, France, and Germany are present. President Hoover is here. King George sends a message expressing his great pleasure, a red letter day, a banner day in the history of Washington, and it is certainly a great day for us.
I think as far as we know, Mr. Folger's first, or certainly one of his earliest exposures to Shakespeare, was a Christmas present from his brother. It was a volume of the complete works. And he kept that book, we have it in the collection, and annotated it throughout the years.
He must have felt immensely privileged to be at Amherst, a young man from an ordinary family. I think that the Amherst education made an indelible mark on him. On the Amherst College Chapel, a lecture by the great aged transcendentalist Ralph Waldo Emerson, the Amherst undergraduates dutifully assembled, and here is Henry Clay Folger, who seems to me a rather earnest young man, taking it all in and becoming inspired by Emerson to read Shakespeare.
Emerson somehow opened a door for Mr. Folger. And I think it sparked something which didn't ignite immediately, but it certainly did later.
I think it must have had a great deal to do with meeting Emily Jordan. Vassar graduate, also interested in Shakespeare.
I think they just were two young people who discovered that they had very similar interests and that they both basically had to make their way in the world. He went to law school and started working in an oil company, and she went to work right after college teaching school. And then after a few years, she decided to do a master's degree on Shakespeare.
They relied on each other in a way which might have been unusual for their time. They traveled, they read together. Their collection is something that they built and created together. A devotion and a passion that's shared between them. To me, when I think about Mr. Folger's career rising through the ranks to become chairman of the board of Standard Oil of New York, I think about the relationship that it would have had to building this collection. And I think something of his determination, his shrewdness, and his sort of organizational skills. There are two landmark acquisitions in the early part of the 20th century. One is in 1904, when Mr. Folger acquired a unique quarto edition of Titus Andronicus.
Now, a quarto is a little book of one play of Shakespeare. And these are very, very rare because people tended to sort of use them up and then throw them away.
And the copy of Titus is the only copy in the world. It was discovered, found by a family in Sweden.
He immediately wires his agent in London and says, "You go up there." And the guy wires back and says, "Well, how much should I offer? You know, what's the highest?" And at that point, Mr. Folger said he really had to think. And so he walked around the streets of New York for 3 hours trying to figure out how much to offer.
He bought it for £2,000. He realized shortly thereafter that it was worth 10 times that. But it's one of the examples of, I think, Folger as a businessman. There were at least two other people who were competing for this volume. And Mr. Folger's agent showed up ready to pay cash. And of course, the rest is history. In 1907, Mr. Folger acquired a copy of the Pavier Quartos. This was the first compilation of Shakespeare's plays, and it's immensely important to Shakespeareans.
Mr. Folger was out on the golf course with his boss, John D. Rockefeller, and Mr. Rockefeller said to him,
"Henry, I see in the newspaper that you've spent $100,000 for a book. Surely that isn't possible." To which Henry calmly replied, Well, sir, you know how the newspapers can exaggerate.
In fact, of course, Mr. Folger had paid that much.
It's one of the great treasures of the library, and it's the book that Mr. Folger chose to hold in the Frank Salisbury portrait from 1927 that now hangs in the old reading room.
As the collection grew, they then began collecting Shakespeare's contemporaries. They began collecting Shakespeare's great source material. So that even as the focus remains Shakespeare, the collection grows to include the great documents of Shakespeare's era.
This is one of the interesting things about the Folgers, is that they had a vision early on that the product of their labors deserved to be in a library.
They were on a train during the World War I, on their way to Hot Springs, Virginia, where they loved to vacation. There was some mix-up in the train schedules, and they had a layover here in Washington. They left Union Station. They walked up in the neighborhood of the Capitol, and it was at that moment that they decided that Washington was the obvious choice for them to build their library.
They thought of this library as a gift to the nation, and there's probably no finer place that it could be than 1 block from the nation's capital.
I'd like to think that Henry and Emily Folger, if they could come back to see the library today, would be enormously proud of what they set in motion. We've added to that programs for the public, exhibitions, performing arts, education, and it's the combination of those activities that makes us unique, that makes us a rich, thriving, proud, ambitious institution, that makes the Folger Library what it is today. I think Henry and Emily Folger would be enormously pleased.